Hello, I'm Fred Kowal, president of United University Professions, and this is The Voice.
I am the voice. I am the union. I am the sign of 100,000 workers strong. I am the voice. I am the clarion call. We are united. There is no one who can make
The Voice podcast is a production of United University Professions, the nation's largest higher education union, representing more than 42,000 academic and professional faculty and retirees at state-operated SUNY campuses and public teaching hospitals in Brooklyn, Stony Brook, and Syracuse. I'm Mike Lisi.
The landmark Inflation Reduction Act, signed into law by President Joe Biden earlier this month, is a very big deal, especially when it comes to the environment. The package invests $369 billion, that's billions with a B, to bring about the energy conversion so necessary to deal with the global climate crisis. Even though it fell short of what Democrats and many green groups originally favored, the bill is the largest environmentally focused legislation in U.S. history. It's easy to see why. The law will reduce about 1 billion metric tons of greenhouse gas emissions by 2030, reducing emissions by at least 50% from 2005 levels. The Inflation Reduction Act also advances environmental justice through several initiatives, including aid for low-income areas, communities of color, and tribal communities. Here in New York, the Climate Leadership and Community Protection Act of 2019, the CLCPA, commits to a carbon-neutral economy with at least 85% reduction in emissions below 1990 levels by 2050. It also calls for a transition to 70% renewable energy by 2030 and zero-emission electricity by 2040. Today on The Voice, we have two experts on environmental issues who can speak to where we are, where we're going, and what needs to be done to get there. Peter Arwanowitz is the Executive Director of Environmental Advocates NY. Peter has served as Acting Commissioner of the State Department of Environmental Conservation and Deputy Secretary for the Environment. He was the first director of the New York State Office of Climate Change. Full disclosure, Environmental Advocates NY is the National Wildlife Federation affiliate in New York State. I sit on the board of directors of the National Wildlife Federation. But first, we'll talk with Sue Fassler, Director of Sustainable Operation at SUNY's College of Environmental Science and Forestry. A UUP member, Sue also co-chairs the statewide UUP Environmental Issues and Advocacy Committee and is on the Tug Hill Tomorrow Land Trust Board of Directors. Welcome, Sue.
Hi, thank you so much. It's so nice to be speaking with you today.
UUP's position, again, over the last couple of years, has really been one that calls on SUNY specifically to be a lead, in fact, the lead state institution in the state's transition to green energy, to sustainability, to addressing climate change. How do you see SUNY taking on that kind of leadership role in a general sense or perhaps specifically as well?
As a SUNY alum, I'm an alum of ESF and a current employee. I think, hope, and wish this is what SUNY wants for itself. This is why I'm excited to work at an institution like this. And it's also, I do believe, very clearly, we talked about the CLCPA, what New York State expects of itself, its state agencies, and its campuses. So I think that's why SUNY, and also the rest of the country, the region, the world is doing this work. At ESF, something we have talked about too is we've been doing this work for over 100 years. It's great that others are doing it too, but we want to retain our place at the top and to attract the best students, the best talent. It's just something that we have to do and we have to address in a way that's more than a high-level, broad brushstroke saying, these are our goals to be carbon neutral. Okay, but how do we get there? We've heard these goals for a long time. How do we actually get there? Another reason why SUNY is because we're everywhere. We have so many campuses spread throughout the state in urban, suburban, rural areas. We have a large workforce. We bring students in from all over. We have a really unique opportunity because we're a huge part of the state operation. What we do at SUNY will have a ripple effect out across the state. And what I love about being on a college campus is we have the freedom to be creative. We have the freedom to do things really well, the freedom to do them not so well. And that's okay because it's a proving ground. Students need to learn what works, what doesn't. You need to kind of embrace and get excited about sometimes a bureaucratic process because you have to learn how the system works so you can fight from within it to change it. And I have been blessed at ESF to have that freedom. And I think that is something that SUNY as a whole does and should welcome more because really sustainability is about systems level change. It's not about changing one thing or two things. It's about taking a holistic view at how we operate as a whole. Also at SUNY, we have a lot of buildings and we use a lot of stuff. So if we're going to be part of the solution, why not lead it? Some of our bills in specific that we're still looking for sponsorship for and have secured some that are really just extraordinarily exciting are we do want to make it so that every campus needs to staff up sustainability wise. So that means staffing up to hire energy focused staff, outreach and engagement staff to serve as advocates and to draw in others on the campus community. And as you know, my personal favorite, zero waste and circularity. Because we hear so much about climate change and energy, buildings, transportation, and that's important. But if we don't look at how we consume and use things, we're missing more than half of the pie, in my opinion. The way to drive home this systemic sustainability related change is through proper resources and proper staffing. If you have staff with the passion, with the focus, with the technical skills to move these things forward, that's where you're really going to see change happen.
Yeah, and I think it's been fascinating because far too often what we see in the environmental movement, but also in advocacy, is the broad brush sweeping changes that are going to be mandated in whether it's in the Green New Deal, which we support and in principle is a great idea. But what really needs to be done is addressing the issues that we face on the ground, really in a day in and day out fashion. And I have to be honest that it had never occurred to me that the issue of surplus property could be such a major environmental focus. And yet, when you took part in one of our panels a couple of years ago, you raised it in such a comprehensive way that Assemblymember Steve Engelbright invited you to be at one of the hearings they were holding because he wanted his colleagues in the legislature to hear about this. And it's become one of our proposals. Could you talk about that proposal and the issue and why it's so important?
It just is so exciting and still blows my mind that something as esoteric and granular as surplus property speaks to so many people on so many levels. Because at the end of the day, everyone can understand the idea of waste and disposing of something that still has life left in it and use left in it. The issue of surplus property, my favorite. It is difficult to donate a lower value item that is state property once it's reached the end of its useful life at a state agency or at a campus. It's not impossible, but the odds are stacked against it, and it really is discouraged. So as a result, if something can't be reused on a campus at a state agency and doesn't sell on the state's eBay site to the general public, a lot of times one of the only viable options and the path of least resistance is disposal. So that means something like a beautiful mid-century modern desk or a really cool antique desk or set of shelves can wind up in the landfill or incinerator. I've got pictures and pictures of myself peeking over dumpsters, snapping photos of things that could and should be reused. We have local nonprofits absolutely starving and begging for these items. So our bill for surplus property recognizes this fact and wants to not circumvent the very important process of making sure that government property and funds are used appropriately, but we want to, in a very controlled way, encourage and allow for the donation of lower value state property. So for instance, a Habitat for Humanity potentially, a local church, a local school, places such as this that either can reuse an item themselves or potentially even resell it to the community. It's a job creator. One of my personal heroes is Diane Cohen of Finger Lakes Reuse. And if you have a chance, you should absolutely visit their stores because now there's multiple. They're a case study, and she has all the economic data to show reuse wins every time. We save on disposal fees, we save on environmental fees. You rightfully so brought up environmental justice. I think it's a travesty that oftentimes state property gets thrown away, which lends itself to polluting in every way, shape, and form, when there are people and places and spaces that are in desperate and dire need for resources and materials. So really, to me, sustainability is taking care of people, and we already have most of the materials we need to do that. So why not make it easy to do so?
What have you seen in terms of the response of legislators? We got sponsors, and sometimes in the work that I do, I get a little frustrated because there's legislation that we propose that to me makes absolute sense. And I can't understand why it doesn't pass quickly and it doesn't get implemented. I've been engaged in this work for a long time, but I am still shocked at how long it can take to get what is necessary done, especially something that is so common sense and basic. How are we doing in the legislature?
I think it's been going really well. We have a chance to meet with legislative staff. Like you said, it just makes sense. I see people's eyes. You never know what you're going to get when you enter into a meeting. Someone can come in being kind of formal, not knowing what to expect, but by the end, there's an energy, it's palpable. There's excitement. The thing that everyone, rightfully so, and I'm so glad they're asking for, is data. Do you have the data on what is currently being disposed? Do you have the return on investment data for these staff members you're hoping to hire? The answer in some cases is yes, but in many cases it's no. And a big part of that is because we don't have the staff and resources to compile that data. The people doing sustainability work on campuses and at the SUNY level are wonderful. They're doing the absolute best that they can. But at the end of the day, we're not going to get the data and see the movement that we need without more investment into those staff and without more funding. It's a chicken and the egg scenario. How do we get this legislation to pass in our current state where we don't have a lot of the data we need and we don't have the staff we need to get that data? Sorry, I work above the garage. So if you're hearing this, it's surplus property moving in action. But yeah, it's a chicken and the egg. How do we get the staff and funding that we need without already having it? But so far, I've been really thrilled with how receptive the legislators seem to be.
And I think it is imperative that the legislators, that the governor, but for that matter, our members and the community at large understand that the crisis that we face in terms of the climate and long-term, the overuse of resources, the overexploitation of the natural world, that is leading to a whole host of impacts and problems for us, that these are issues that they're going to take the development of responses and solutions that cross the spectrum, cover a whole different bunch of areas where we deal with human life. But then also, it's going to be incumbent on all of us to do sometimes what seem to be very mundane things in changing what we do. I do have to ask you, are you hopeful that at one level, obviously, that we get legislation passed that's going to improve things, but at the same time, overall, in your work, in your professional career, as one who focuses on sustainability, are we as a state, as a nation, as a society, as a species, are we going to win the race against the problems that we've created? Big philosophical question, but I'd love to hear what you have to say about it.
My default personality is optimism.
Good.
I'm eternally an optimist. I always think a solution can be found. So I do still think there's hope, but it's also how I'm wired, and I don't see any other way to move forward because we don't really have the option of giving up. I get a lot of hope, as cliche as it is, and you probably feel this too, with working with students. I think the students coming into ESF right now, they have knowledge, they have ideas, but most importantly, they want to be part of the solution. They don't just want to say, this is a problem, go fix it. They're like, okay, but how do I get involved? How do I lend my energy and myself? And that's what we're going to need. We can't have people turn off. And sometimes I've thought about it too, like, wouldn't it just be easier if I could just work in a career where I wasn't always trying to swim against the current and fix something? But you surround yourself with people that want to do similar things, whether it's sustainability or fighting for change in something else. That kind of just keeps you going. I think there will be hope as a society if we can all kind of slow down I do worry that things are moving too quickly to make good decisions and to think processes through in a way that makes sense. I think everything's just moving a bit too quickly, and I don't exactly know why. The virtual world definitely is partially at fault for that. I think there's hope if we look at the root cause of things and don't try to solve with a solution that's too little too late. And that's why I'm drawn to consumption so much, I think. Because if we realize that at some point enough is enough, you can still live a beautiful, meaningful, healthful life without always looking for more and without always needing more, there's enough for everyone to live that type of life. So I think it's just a general reframing around society of what is enough. And I think there's hope no matter what people's viewpoints are, because everyone feels that pull of nostalgia. Everyone feels the pull of, I wish life were slower, or I wish we could go back to this period in time. So I think there's an in there. And I see a lot of hope too, because I've worked with colleagues over time that didn't traditionally maybe believe in climate change, or it's something they didn't really want to talk about. And through building relationships and learning who they are as people and what interests them, they did the same with me. And one of the things I love talking about is one of my former colleagues in Florida was in that former camp of not really wanting to engage with climate change. And we built a beautiful friendship over 3 years. And by the time it came to create the city's sustainability action plan, I had to create a committee. He was on it. I was the little green girl, and he was kind of my enforcer. Like in meetings, she was talking like, let's do this, or let's come up with this idea. And by the time when we had the plan, he was one of the biggest champions of it. So it takes time, it takes energy, it takes pleasant persistence, as I like to jokingly say on campus, but I do still think there's hope.
Do you think, and this is something that I've pondered for a long time, do you think that the emphasis on sustainability, that term, or the approach that basically says, look, we're not going to have to really change our lifestyles all that much. There's going to be the best of both worlds. We're going to find the magic bullets that are going to enable us to avoid worsening the climate crisis and all of the other associated environmental issues. We're going to be able to do that, and we're all going to be able to continue to live the lifestyle we are. Now, I realize that could be the case. My own personal feeling is that sometimes that's a trap, and it avoids the difficult choices that may have to be made, especially if you consider the global implications of the crises that we face. They are not New York crises. They are global crises, and they are impacting people in Africa, in the Pacific, in areas of Latin America today, and in the United States, in Native communities in Alaska, in the communities of the folks who live along the Gulf of Mexico already. And these are communities of color. These are communities that do not have economic resources. Where do you feel is the way forward on the whole issue of whether or not we need to face the reality we've got to change?
Oh, I think we need to absolutely face the reality. And I think one of the most difficult things that people will have to do is just shift their entire mindset. Like I said in my previous response, shifting from more to enough is enough, and to going a little bit more towards localism, autonomy, helping your neighbor. A lot of people think that they have that ethic and that default, when in actuality they really might not. So a lot of people, it's easy to talk, it's easy to say, it's a lot more difficult to do. And I agree with you. It's also a privileged thing to be talking about this. I have the privilege of knowing I can make choices in my life. I can afford the products, or afford to forego the products that I need to meet the lifestyle that I want to set for myself. And I recognize that's coming from a very privileged place. And sustainability is different for every person, dependent upon so many different factors. So yeah, people are going to have to give things up. But I also think framing it that way makes it really easy for the other side, whatever that might be, to shoot down.
Yep.
Because that's the headline. That's what sticks with people. So I think we just have to I don't want to be disingenuous and play the strategy chess game, but you almost have to in a way. I think all you can do is kind of keep yourself in check and gently and kindly remind those near you to do it. And I have this constant tension and discussion a lot with my sister of, Can you influence the individual and the system as a whole? Is it still possible to be within the system and influence it, or do you have to work from without? And that's something I'm still not sure. And that's why I'm really excited for this committee, because this is really my first foray into working within a system with a group that does hold a relative position of power. And I'm working within the SUNY system to try to strive for and fight for change. And I do feel like there's an appetite for it within the system. So I haven't given up on that hope yet.
The last question I want to ask you, Sue, is, and you've talked a bit about this, what is it in your personal background that brought you to do the work that you do professionally? Where does this spring from in your experience and so forth?
I grew up about 45 minutes north of Syracuse in very, very rural Oswego County, and I just so happen to live there again now. I had a great childhood with parents that really loved the land. I would go on lots of wood walks with them. They would kind of block my sister and I outside, or we'd be reading books. Yeah, so I just had a lot of great memories being outside, and it's just where I guess I'm a pretty hyperactive person, and life can oftentimes feel fragmented, but when I'm outside, like, it just doesn't. It just makes me feel nice. So when I was applying for colleges, all my application letters just felt kind of forced until I wrote ESFs, and it felt very authentic and real to me. I feel like a lot of my life, it's interesting. I'm a really planning-oriented type A person, but I feel like I've just kind of stumbled into a lot of my life somehow. When I was about to graduate from ESF, I met a mentor and now my actually current boss, because I was just, sustainability was so broad. I felt like I knew a lot, but I didn't have an expertise. So I was like, how do I get a job? How do I market myself? What do I care about? And I met him, happens to also be from Oswego County, and he's really involved in materials management and zero waste. He's like, have you thought about trash, recycling, consumption? I was like, not really, but it's really interesting to me. So that kind of sparked me, just that conversation, that kind of nudge, and I found my thing. I wanted to get out of my comfort zone a little bit, so I moved down to South Florida, sight unseen, and I was the Green Initiatives Coordinator for the city of Hallandale Beach for a while, and I loved that job. It just felt like I was in the right career, and I really liked government work. But I missed home. I missed being outside. I didn't enjoy living in a condo. I wanted to walk out barefoot into the grass, and Central New York does that for me. And when the opportunity came to apply for a job at ESF that I didn't think I was qualified for, I went through the exercise of applying and I got it and I love it. I really like fighting for systems change. And that is how I frame sustainability, as I mentioned before. So I feel like the first and real most deliberate action I've ever taken and have taken in my life is to decide that this is my passion, is zero waste and consumption. It pervades like every second of my being, not in an annoying way where it's stressful to me. It's just authentically who I am. So I just feel very, very lucky. Sometimes it's hard because I can easily work like a 55-hour week and the days just slide by because there's so much work to be done, but it's also worthwhile. And I think right now as a society, we're to the point where people want to see solutions. People are sick of hearing goals and promises. We're to the solutions phase. And I think I'm just really lucky that my mind is just wired to be a solutions and logistics person. So I just think sustainability is the perfect field for that.
Thanks very much for being a part of UUP and for doing the great work you're doing, obviously in your professional work, but also with our Environmental Issues Committee. And I look forward to continuing our work. There is so much to be done, but it is exciting to know that there are committed folks within our membership and in our SUNY community who want to make the change that's necessary. Thank you for taking the time today.
No, thank you so much. This was an absolute pleasure. I've been smiling the whole time. I wish everyone could see it, but thank you.
And now we're joined by Peter Awanowitz, the Executive Director of Environmental Advocates NY, who has partnered with UUP in support of the legislation that Sue Fassler previously discussed, while we've also worked with Environmental Advocates NY on support and in support of the CLCPA, major legislation passed just a couple of years ago. So, Peter, welcome.
Yeah, Fred, thanks. It's great to be here.
I want us to start basically where we were leaving off with Sue Fassler in the discussion about how important things that can be done at the local level, at the SUNY level, at the state level, in addressing the climate crisis and the various environmental challenges we face. And your work has certainly been involved with this. Perhaps we can start with that historic legislation from a couple of years ago, the CLCPA. And if you could tell us how that legislation came about, but then perhaps most importantly for our listeners, where we are right now in the process of implementing that important legislation.
Yeah, it's a great place to start. So 3 years ago, this past summer, New York State enacted a new climate law, which is known as the Climate Leadership and Community Protection Act. And it ushered in what the New York Times called back in 2019, the world's most ambitious climate plan. And that might seem like hyperbole, but it's not. I mean, the first reason is that New York State committed in law to dramatic reductions in emissions, much more so than even California did when they enacted their landmark legislation. We have legal mandates to essentially zero out all human-induced greenhouse gas emissions, primarily from fossil fuels, but there are other categories, by 2050. There's no ifs, ands, or buts about this. There's no way to sort of achieve the mandates of the law unless we move entirely away from combusting fossil fuels and even biofuels by 2050. There's interim goals in 2030 that we're going to achieve half of our pollution reduction cuts. And 2030 is now like 7.5 years from today. Right. So a massive reduction and a scale up of programs is going to happen in the next 7.5 years. The other piece of the law, and this sets us head and shoulders above states like California and even where the federal government is going, is that we are going to really ensure that as we transition our entire economy of New York State off of fossil fuels, that we will do it with just transition for workers and those on the front lines of the climate crisis, particularly those living in environmental justice zones. That legal mandate and the prioritization that is then required of state agencies to take equity and social justice and put that at the forefront doesn't exist in any other states in the country. When they've done their climate laws, they've focused on emissions. New York State has a dual mandate: pollution reductions, social justice and equity for frontline communities, and a just transition for workers as we transition away from fossil fuels into the clean energy economy.
As you discussed the emphasis that the legislation places on equity and social justice and the terminology used and the important terminology, the just transition, where have unions been? You know where UUP stands, of course, but I'm thinking about the building trades. I'm thinking about those involved in the electrical generating systems that are presently in place. Have they come along? Are they coming around? Where are they in this work?
After several years of advocating for this law and pushing our leaders, the governor, the assembly speaker, and the majority leader to actually, pass the law in 2019, I was appointed by Assembly Speaker Carl Hastie to be one of the 22 members of the state's Climate Action Council. So I not only am sort of like at the table, sort of in the finer details of drafting New York State's plan of how we achieve all these goals, but this past spring, I traveled around the state with colleagues at the Climate Action Council, hearing from the public, hearing from unions, hearing from a whole range of perspectives of what people thought about the draft plan that was out for comment this past spring. And a big part of the comment period was hearing from workers who are in the fossil fuel industry, who are now sort of seeing that this transition to clean energy is going to mean a transition in the workforce. There will be certain jobs that will cease to exist. I'll pick one that's probably the biggest area of jobs that will cease to exist is people who work in corner gasoline stations. As we transition to 100% electric vehicles, we will have less and less need for corner gasoline stations, and therefore workers who are at those facilities right now will probably be working in other areas over the next 20 to 30 years. I can certainly appreciate if I was working at a power plant or in the natural gas industry and was sort of, wondering, okay, what does this mean about my future employment, my work? And there's a lot of concern. I think, New York State and the Climate Action Council in particular needs to do a better job of developing the types of entrepreneurship, transition programs, apprenticeship programs, so that as we make this transition, we can do it with a greater sense of justice for workers and for the communities where these fossil fuel facilities are located. So there's certainly a lot of angst, a lot of fear as this transition goes forward, completely understandable. But there are, new ways of sort of thinking about our energy sector. And one in particular, this is going to get real weedy, but there was a bill passed at the end of this past legislative session in early June. It was signed by the governor, and it simply allows natural gas companies to enter a new area of business. Right now in New York State, they're only allowed to transmit natural gas. What this new law is going to do, and it was done with union support with the building trades and AFL, CIO, and others, will allow for natural gas companies to get into what we call network geothermal. So instead of moving gas through the pipes, new pipes will be sort of needed to move heat through our communities to buildings, to residential sort of development. So there's things like that are starting to be spun out of the Climate Action Council process that will usher in new ways of generating, new ways of transmitting, and new ways of consuming energy. Like I said at the beginning, this transition is not going to happen overnight. Some of this transition will happen in the next 7.5 years. A lot of it will happen in between now and 2050. So we have built into our law the time for the transition to ensure that equity and justice and the just transition from workers occurs. But science says we got to move. The clock is ticking very loudly with the climate crisis, and there is little time to waste. So we have to get working right away on this transition.
It's something that we have argued for going back to, the first proposals that UUP made were back in 2014, session maybe spring of 2015, on utilizing specifically the tech campuses in SUNY that have struggled with enrollment and their mission really going back since the mid-'90s. My home campus is Cobleskill, so I'm deeply aware of the challenges that these campuses have faced, as have community colleges. And so what we proposed back then, far ahead of the time of the CLCPA, and I'm not saying, we were far ahead in terms of seeing what was coming, but it was the idea that it was clear that there needed to be a transition. And what we in UUP have argued for, and it has been a bit of a frustrating time in terms of arguing and advocating for this, is that SUNY is uniquely positioned as the largest public university system in the country to provide the kind of retraining for the workforce that is going to move from, as you said, working at gas stations to working in other areas, or for that matter, to work in the transition that will develop alternative energy projects across New York State that will be necessary. How do you feel about where SUNY has been, or maybe more importantly, where SUNY could be in terms of being a lead institution in the conversion?
The leadership that you have brought and where UUP has been on this issue for, nearly a decade has been tremendous. I only wish we, as a state in the legislature and the governor acted on some of those proposals, 8-9 years ago when they were first made. To me, I've always viewed SUNY as an amazing microcosm of broader society in New York. If you just think about, some of the flagship campuses and other campuses, you house people, you feed people, you need energy, you produce energy, you transport them in some of the bigger systems. That's society, right? And it should be that demonstration of the possible. As local governments all across New York State are starting to contemplate how they align their decisions for land use, for planning, how to incorporate renewable energy technology in their towns, they'll be starting to think about new housing developments that will be not linked to fossil fuels in any way. If we had SUNY acting as a microcosm of how to actually do this and demonstrate the technology, but also educate the next generation of the workforce along the way for all these things we talked about, that would be just a tremendous asset, not only to the local leaders who were sort of struggling with how they, with very limited resources, accomplish this transition. New Yorkers would really benefit if we actively and aggressively sort of looked at implementation of the climate law at the local level, at the SUNY systems. And you raise a really wonderful point there, just to close out my thoughts on this topic, but educating and training the next workforce, not only in clean energy technology so that gasoline station worker can transition into electric vehicle sector, work, but also think about the decommissioning of gasoline stations. I mean, there are thousands of them across New York State. We're about to sort of release some maps of where they're located. If we don't get ahead of the thinking curve, and SUNYs that are embedded in communities could be a key place to start thinking about this, is what do we envision for these sites?
Right.
If the gasoline companies just walk away from them, they're just a bunch of polluted, blighted parcels on our landscapes that could be put to good use. And there are ample examples of, cleanup of these sites because they're kind of brownfields level toxicity.
That's right.
Affordable housing in New York City with daycare centers. I mean, so you can really clean them up and create healthful environments. So just starting to incubate the thinking through the ingenuity and the education of SUNY system across would be just really tremendous, just on that issue alone. And that's just one small fraction of the transition we have to be thinking about.
Recently, it was just within the last few weeks, California, it's almost like there's competition between California and New York on these things. Governor Newsom announced that, and it was done through the legislature, but California would ban all vehicles in terms of internal combustion engines by 2035. How does that match up with the goals of the Climate Leadership and Community Protection Act? Does that put California, I hate to put it this way, ahead of us in terms of the curve, but at the same time raise issues, as you've just talked about? California, for any of us who have been out there, and I have, there's a lot of gas stations. And then there's also the question of all of these electric vehicles needing electricity to come from non-carbon-based electrical generating facilities. So there are a lot of issues regarding this. But how did you see that decision, and how will that move the ball forward?
I mean, it's an amazing new step that California has taken. They've been working on vehicle emissions and setting the national standard for decades, right? They were given that authority under the 1970 Clean Air Act. And in 1977, Congress said other states that want to opt into the California program can do so. And New York has been aligned with the California emission standard since the first Cuomo administration in 1992. New York opted in. And a number of us in the advocacy community saw in 2020 where California was going. And we advanced legislation in New York that was passed by the legislature in the spring of 2021 and signed by then, now Governor Hochul. One of the first bills she signed in September of 2021. That was essentially say that when California acts, New York, by legal mandate, will copy. Right. It may seem minor, but the significant thing is now we have a legal mandate in New York to align ourselves with the California standards, where up until last year, it was at the whim of the executive to make that decision. So now the legislature has said, this is where things are moving. This is where the economy is moving. This is where we need to be. So we will be pushing the Hochul administration to begin that rulemaking next year.
Good.
So that we can be aligned with California's timing. And the early years timing on this is really important. They want to start the first mandate. It's 30% of new sales need to be electric by 2026 model year. If New York State adopts the regulations in 2023, we will be in the same time frame as California. And that really aligns with where we need to be with the climate law and where the Climate Action Council's draft plan is going to be. We need to get about 30% of New York's motor vehicles, cars and trucks. We need a third of them to be electric by 2030. And that's just not a third of new, but a third of all vehicles, of that category on New York roads need to be electric in 7.5 years. So we've got to get moving. We've got to set the regulatory certainty. Workers need to understand where this whole transition is going forward and what types of job opportunities there will be for electric vehicle component manufacturing in New York and elsewhere. Because this transition's coming by market forces and legal statute, and it's going to make a big difference in whether or not New York can achieve its emissions reduction cuts that's required by 2030. Vehicles are the second biggest source of our emissions in New York.
Yeah, and it makes me ponder that when we talk about this transition it's looming quickly, it's coming on us quickly, that the level of the infrastructure change. We've talked about the fact of decommissioning of gasoline stations, the necessity for a lot more charging stations and that inherent infrastructure, which can generate jobs, which in the upstate economy is a real problem because unemployment lags in the upstate communities. We also see the auto manufacturers are, in many respects, ahead of the politicians on this. Certainly in the Republican Party, where there's been this terrible opposition to anything in terms of addressing the climate crisis. But the manufacturers are cognizant of where things are moving, and so they are prepared for this transition. What roadblocks do you see in terms of the manufacturing side of moving us towards electric vehicles? That might also be something that perhaps SUNY institutions or higher ed institutions could play a role in addressing.
Right off the top, I don't see any significant roadblocks other than just volume and scale. I'm fortunate to own an electric vehicle that has a 350-mile range, and I toured New York State all this spring and never had any concern about getting between point A and point B, because I don't have a lot of competition for the charging network that was there. And I also want to give a plug to Sue Fassler. She set up an amazing, nice charger at SUNY ESF that provided me the boosted range for the 3 hours, 4 hours I was there during the climate hearing in April, right around the corner from the building. So it was perfect. And, I do a lot of road tripping personally, and I haven't run into that problem. But that's because I'm also in a position where primarily I can charge my electric vehicle at home. 95% of the charging I do is at home. Not everybody is in that situation. And we clearly need more publicly available charging, curbside charging in our urban communities. I was just out on the Thruway this past weekend, totally flabbergasted that one of the new rest stops that just must have opened up a couple days ago. There's not one electric vehicle charger there. I was just blown. My wife was like, "You need to calm down." I said, how do you go through a redesign and rebuild 3 years after the CLCPA? I don't know what's going on at the Thruway Authority, but boy, they blew it. I hope that it's just a matter of time, and maybe there's supply chain issues getting things there. But I've seen with my eyes the supercharging stations that NYPA can do. I stopped next to one on my trip back from the Binghamton climate hearing in Oneonta, and the charger's there, the networks are there. It's at a private gasoline station right off of I-88. So I don't know why we don't have this built into our Thruway system. It would be a great benefit to those consumers who need that level of charging for the EVs, and we can generate it. So that, I think, is the bigger problem, not manufacturing. I think it's just volume and scale at this point. Once people sort of realize the inherent benefits of electric drive over internal combustion, it's usually like a no-brainer. People won't go back. The volatility of gasoline prices is one piece of it. So, sorry, I went a little bit long, but I just love EVs and talking about it. And there's a lot of things the state's got to get their act together better, and most of it's tied up in charging.
Yeah. At the same time as New York State has led the way, certainly with CLCPA, and California, obviously, with its impacts, we finally got something historic out of the federal government in the past month with the passage of the curiously named Inflation Reduction Act. We don't know exactly how much it'll do for inflation. We know what it's intended to do on the climate crisis. What are your reactions to what was passed in terms of the high points? And let's just start right there.
Yeah, I mean, my feelings about the historic legislation are mixed. It will help New Yorkers make the transition at the personal level. There'll be incentives and tax breaks for purchase of electric vehicles, the same thing with their household energy systems. So it will certainly reduce the upfront cost for those people who are ready to make the switch now. And that's can't be ignored. That is tremendous. There will be significant block grants available for frontline communities to help their vision of just transition. I hope that program can come together quickly enough, because the time period on that one is shorter than the other ones. So I think it's tremendous. I mean, Senator Schumer, didn't have all the cards on his side of the table when he sat down with Senator Manchin. So he definitely negotiated a pretty amazing deal for the country, and something that was going to have significant benefits as New Yorkers, enter into this transition phase and move away from fossil fuel furnaces in their homes, internal combustion vehicles, a lot of different things. So that's really tremendous there. And the infrastructure legislation before that will help also with things like electric vehicle charging and mass transit build-outs and keeping the MTA afloat, et cetera. So there's a lot of good that's happening. I mean, the mixed feelings are there are going to be communities in New York that will be hurt by this deal. And there are going to be communities across the country that will be hurt by this deal if we continue to build out fossil fuel infrastructure. So there are big fights ahead. And so it's not a 100% celebration on this side. In fact, there's a lot of concern for our allies who are in the Gulf Coast states of this country and places where they'll see more fossil fuel infrastructure at a time where we should be putting an end to that and stop digging the hole deeper.
I remember the first time my son lives and works with his wife in Houston, Texas, teaches down there, and they both do. And the first time I drove to Houston, I enjoyed traveling long distances. I love driving. And what I was thinking after driving through along the Louisiana coast, but then especially through Beaumont, through Port Arthur, and getting into the east side of Houston, which if anyone's ever been in Houston, you know what I'm talking about. This is a massive region. This is not just a city. It is, if you want to see sprawl, go to Houston. It will take you half a day to get across the city of Houston, in part because of traffic that is incredibly horrible. But what I was thinking was, everyone who drives a car that is an internal combustion engine, I have a hybrid at this point, should make it a point to drive through that area of the country just to see and to smell what it's like. If you drive through North Jersey, you get a little bit of a taste of it. But if you drive through Port Arthur and Beaumont and some of the cities on the Louisiana side, it is incredible. It's like a science fiction movie to see these massive refineries that are all around you. That's the story of where our present energy system is coming from and what it depends upon. And then you have to think about the fact that there are people living in this area and working there. And that's what we depend on. We don't want to get into NIMBY situations because the situation in Nigeria and in a lot of the places where we depend on imported fuel or to fuel the global economy, it's even worse. I think it's important for us to realize there are real costs to a continued dependence on fossil fuels. Sometimes you need to come face to face with it. It's like seeing an open pit coal mine, which I have seen out in Wyoming and Montana, where I used to live. It's devastating. And for many of us, we just never come into contact with that. We don't see the reality of what we depend on.
The energy sort of comes from away, that we don't have that visceral relationship and that public health impact associated with New York State, we're an import state. We don't refine product here. No. We store it. We have some gasoline station workers, but we spend about, and this is older dollars, not in sort of the current price of gasoline, about $30 billion every year in New York just on oil for transportation needs to move people and goods between point A and point B. And as we transition away from that, not only will that significantly improve the lives and livelihood of people who live in those fence line communities you spoke of, but think of, as we retain that net worth, that value, $30 billion, 85% of it flows directly out of state as I'm speaking here today. That will stay in New York as we transition our transportation sector off of combustion of fossil fuels. Another big piece of the climate action plan is the tremendous public health benefits that will accrue to New Yorkers. And indeed to people living in those communities where the fuels we consume right now are being produced. Those will have huge benefits. And many politicians in Albany at legislative hearings, they kind of just walk past that tremendous benefit to New Yorkers of improved health and lives, reductions in the money we spend on healthcare, as if it doesn't really add up. They focus in on what is this going to cost the individual in terms of switching over to electric vehicles and electric furnaces. And that's a part of it, but an equal part of it is that people are struggling to pay healthcare expenses, that's right, prescription costs, healthcare costs, people who die prematurely, and the value there. There are huge benefits on that side of it for New Yorkers to act and act quickly on climate change. And indeed, the Climate Council's analysis says that failing to act and ignoring the problem and just sort of assuming, well, we can't act, because the bills might be too high. Failing to do that is more costly than making the transition to clean energy to the tune of $100 billion over the next 30 years.
It's dramatic. I'd like to ask one more question, which is, as we've gotten through a lot of specifics here, I'll get us into, as I like to do, get us into a little philosophical realm. Are you hopeful that we as a society can address this massive existential crisis? And if so, where does that hope come from? Or conversely, are you pessimistic?
Well, it's definitely philosophical, but I have to be hopeful. You think about the future generations, you want to leave them a planet that they can inhabit. So I feel that moral compunction to be hopeful. But I'm also hopeful because What I also saw at these hearings, we definitely saw the fear and concern of workers who are going to be transitioning. But I also saw just New Yorkers who came to these public hearings with the Climate Council with that expression of the can-do spirit, telling stories about how they electrified personally. I mentioned the electric vehicle charger at SUNY's ESF, and a number of the SUNY campuses have renewable energy projects going on. And the next generation who is just eager to sort of work into this space and take acting on climate as a given. Yeah. They don't worry too much about people are denying. They just grew up with this sort of understanding of this is what we need to act. And so many SUNY programs now have environmental science, as part of what's going on. So I'm hopeful because as the older generations who are more prone to denial of the issue and want to walk away from it for whatever reasons they choose, more of the emerging generation coming up is ready to tackle this issue and ready to understand it. And they already are starting to live, work, and play in vastly different ways that aren't solely dependent on motor vehicles or fossil fuels. And I'm hopeful because I think we have the right political leadership right now, currently in Washington, but also here in New York State, that views acting on climate as something they want to do, not a political have to. And that's really important. I think Governor Hochul in particular has impressed me as a governor who really wants to act on climate. A lot of work to be done, but that's why I'm hopeful.
I think you've left us in the perfect spot today, Peter. And
I hope so.
Yeah. Neither you nor I would do the work that we do if we weren't hopeful, because we deal with the future. Thank you, Peter, for your time. This has been wonderful.
Thanks for the conversation. Great to be with you, Fred.
And now, here's 3 things to know. More than 2 million New Yorkers with federal student loan debt will benefit from the new student loan forgiveness program announced in August by President Joe Biden. In an August 28 press release, Senate Majority Leader Chuck Schumer said that more than $16 billion in student debt would be wiped out in New York State alone under Biden's program. More than 1 million people will wind up with their student debt totally forgiven. Another 2.25 million will get some debt relief. Biden announced August 24th the cancellation of $10,000 in student debt for Americans who earn less than $125,000 per year or live in households earning less than $250,000 annually. Biden also extended a pause on loan payments until the end of the year. And he said undergraduate loan repayments would be capped at 5% of a person's monthly income, down from 10%. The average SUNY graduate with a baccalaureate degree leaves college with an average of $27,000 in school loans. Starbucks Workers United, the union representing Starbucks employees at stores in New York and across the country, is asking other unions and labor supporters to sign its no contract, no coffee pledge. Starbucks Workers United has won union elections at 225 stores, representing more than 6,000 workers. By signing the pledge, supporters agreed to join Starbucks picket lines and in other calls to action. To sign the pledge, go to the Starbucks Workers United website at sbworkersunited.org. Exotic dancers at the Star Garden Topless Dive Bar in North Hollywood have filed a petition for a union election with the National Labor Relations Board. If successful, the strippers, who would affiliate with Actors Equity Association, would be the only exotic dancers in America with union representation. Actors Equity President Kate Schindel said her union supports the strippers' attempt to unionize. She said the dancers are fighting for protections against discrimination, sexual harassment, and unjust terminations. They are also seeking health insurance and workers' compensation rights. Star Garden would become the first unionized strip club since 1996, when dancers at a club in San Francisco formed the Exotic Dancers Union and affiliated with the Service Employees International Union. That bar closed in 2013. And now here's Fred with Kowal's Coda.
Thanks, Mike. Hell of a transition there. Today, I've got 2 books to recommend to you, and it might be odd that I've chosen these 2. That's because they are related to COVID, and for reasons I can't fully grasp. I may understand the reasons, but I just can't accept them. Humans on this planet, for the most part, are done with COVID. It's still infecting people, making them very sick, hospitalizing some, and killing some. The latter, those who have died, are almost exclusively the unvaccinated. So to take a step back from the day in and day out news that many of us are subjected to, I've been reading Pox by Michael Wilrich, a very good history of the smallpox outbreak in the first few years of the 20th century. If you know anything about smallpox, this was a devastating disease that, in fact, wiped out entire Native American nations back in the 1617 and 1800s. It's a fascinating read, especially in its discussion and exploration of the anti-vaxxers of that day. They were overwhelmingly from the anti-progressive, pro-individual choice political sectors of the day. They were also, for the most part, focused on certain religious organizations. There are so many similarities in terms of who the anti-vaxxers are today. But Wilrich also details how by the 1920s, and certainly after World War II, the progressive idea that government needed to be the instrument of social good had really triumphed. Not always with the best of intentions, not always with the best of results, but certainly in the case of smallpox, because smallpox was eradicated through vaccination. The second book details how Donald Trump utterly failed this nation and its people for his own narcissistic ends. I can't recommend more highly Carol Leonnig and Phil Rucker's I Alone Can Fix It. This terribly disturbing look at Trump's last year in office shows how a crisis really does display the makeup of a leader. Our greatest presidents took responsibility and took control in crises and led. Remarkably, Trump even went so far as to say publicly at one point that he felt he had no responsibility for what was happening as COVID spread quickly across our land. There was no urgency in the face of the threat, only a denial of its severity, and always decisions made based on what he, foolishly as it turned out, thought would help him win re-election. Yes, to everyone listening, Donald Trump lost the election. But worst of all, he encouraged the lunacy of the anti-mask sentiment in the summer of 2020. He also has done nothing to use his political power, still with great influence, in order to get his rabid followers to be vaccinated. In the end, Trump, the narcissist, turned the progressive philosophy on its head, though, of course, let's be honest, Ronald Reagan started us down this road. In this society, according to this view, we're all on our own. In the time of a pandemic, that makes us all vulnerable. A person who refuses to be vaccinated out of some ignorant political belief, I'm holding to a separate category those with health reasons or religious reasons. Anyone who refuses to be vaccinated out of some sort of political belief endangers himself and all of us, vaccinated as well. That is a violation of our duty to each other as members of a human community. This virus can only be stopped if it, just like with smallpox, is eradicated through vaccination of nearly the entire population of the world. And we're not even close. Trump failed us, but his minions and enablers in Congress, in state capitals, and in the media share in his responsibility, whether they want it or not. Good night and good luck.
The Voice Podcast is a production of United University Professions. You can find UUP on Facebook, Twitter, and Instagram at uupinfo.org. UUP is on the web at uupinfo.org. This episode was produced and directed by Mike Lisi, UUP's Director of Media and Publications. Special thanks to UUP Director of Administration, Lynn Alderman. Thank you for listening.